The guillotine was designed for efficiency, one clean drop, a fraction of a second. Revolutionary France considered it the most advanced method of capital punishment ever invented. So when Jean-Baptiste Carrier knelt before the blade on December 16, 1794, surrounded by 30,000 screaming Parisians, no one expected what happened next. The machine refused to work properly. Now, guillotine malfunctions were rare. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of Paris, had personally refined this machine over decades. He'd used it on nearly 3,000 people, including King Louis XVI himself. He knew exactly how it worked. But according to Sanson's own son, writing years later in memoirs about his father's career, "Never had I seen the guillotine fail so dramatically. It was as if the machine itself rebelled against granting Carrier an easy death." The crowd watching believed they understood why. They believed God himself wanted Carrier to suffer, because of what Carrier had done to thousands of people in a city called Nantes. See, Jean-Baptiste Carrier had invented something. He called it vertical deportation, a clean, bureaucratic phrase. What it actually meant was loading hundreds of bound prisoners onto specially modified barges, rowing them into the middle of the Loire River, and then pulling plugs from the bottom of the boats so the water would slowly rise and everyone aboard would drown together. Men, women, children, priests, nuns, the elderly, the young. The Loire became so choked with corpses that authorities banned using its water for drinking. And now the man responsible was about to discover that the revolutionary machine he had served so faithfully could turn against him too. But first, he would have to face something perhaps even worse than death. He would have to sit in a courtroom for 11 weeks and listen to what he had done. To understand how Jean-Baptiste Carrier ended up on that scaffold, we need to go back to the autumn of 1793. To a city that the revolutionary government in Paris viewed with deep suspicion. Nantes sits on the Loire River in Brittany, in western France. In 1793 it was one of the wealthiest cities in the country. And the source of that wealth? The slave trade. Nantes' merchant elite had grown rich transporting human beings across the Atlantic, and they weren't particularly enthusiastic about radical revolutionaries in Paris telling them what to do. But Nantes had a bigger problem than just political unreliability. The entire region was on fire. Just inland from Nantes, a massive royalist uprising called the War in the Vendée was tearing through western France. Catholic peasants, loyal to the old king and the old church, had risen up against the revolution. They were winning battles. They were threatening to march on Paris itself. The National Convention, the revolutionary government, needed someone to pacify this region, someone committed, someone who wouldn't hesitate. They chose Jean-Baptiste Carrier. Now here's something worth understanding about Carrier. He wasn't some aristocratic general or political operator from a powerful family. He was the son of tenant farmers from a tiny village called Yolet, near Aurillac in the Auvergne, about as rural and unglamorous as France gets. He'd worked his way up, law clerk in Paris, country attorney back home, member of the local Jacobin club. When the revolution came, Carrier saw his opportunity and seized it. By 1792 he was a deputy to the National Convention. He voted for the execution of Louis XVI. He helped overthrow the moderate Girondists. He was, by all measures, a true believer in the revolutionary cause. The convention didn't send a monster to Nantes. They sent a committed revolutionary. What happened next would transform him into something else entirely. Carrier arrived in Nantes in October 1793 with broad authority as a représentant du peuple en mission, a representative of the people on mission. His official orders were to suppress the royalist revolt and maintain order. How he interpreted those orders would become the subject of his eventual trial. His first targets were refractory priests, Catholic clergy who had refused to swear oaths under the revolution's religious policies. About 90 of them had been arrested and imprisoned in Nantes during the summer of 1793. On the evening of November 16th, 1793, these 90 priests were loaded onto a barge at the docks of Nantes. This wasn't an ordinary barge. It had been specially modified. The sides were railed off so that no one aboard could escape. And crucially, valves had been built into the sides and bottom of the vessel, valves that could be opened from the outside. The barge was rowed out into the Loire to a point far enough from shore that swimming would be nearly impossible. Then the valves were opened. Water began flooding in, slowly at first, then faster. According to contemporary accounts, boats with guards followed in the vessel's wake. Whenever a priest managed to struggle to the surface, he was shot at. For target practice, the witnesses said. Despite this, 3 priests somehow escaped. They were rescued by sailors on the river, but Carrier's soldiers found them and forced the sailors to give the priests back. Those 3 priests were drowned in a second execution the following night. After this first mass drowning, something happened that would later be used as evidence against Carrier. A grand feast was held on a barge, a celebration costing 40,000 livres. At this feast, Carrier allegedly raised a toast to the successful execution of his victims. He called what he had done vertical deportation, and he was just getting started. Here's what historians have pieced together from trial records and contemporary accounts. The drownings weren't random acts of cruelty. They were systematic. On December 4th and 5th, 1793, a meeting of the Revolutionary Committee of Nantes took place. At this meeting, Carrier and his associates appointed a jury to create a list of condemned criminals. Within a single day, that jury presented over 300 names demanding execution. 300 death sentences in one day. The scale was the point. The prisons of Nantes were overflowing. Disease was spreading through the cramped cells. Traditional executions, even by guillotine, simply couldn't keep pace with the number of prisoners. Carrier's solution was industrial. The barges used for these drownings were called lighters, flat-bottomed vessels normally used for transporting cargo. Workers modified them by building plugs into their sides and bottoms at water level. When these plugs were pulled, water would rush in and the vessel would sink. The process was designed to be efficient. Load prisoners aboard, row out to a designated spot in the Loire, usually near Chantenay-sur-Loire, pull the plugs from separate boats or from shore, wait for the screaming to stop and then do it again. Different sources give different estimates for how many times this happened. Historian Roger Dupuy suggests between 7 and 11 separate drowning operations, with 300 to 400 victims each time. Jacques Soussanet estimates that between 1,800 and 4,800 people drowned on Carrier's direct orders, with perhaps another 2,000 drowned by other Republican revolutionaries operating in Nantes. Carrier himself, during questioning, claimed to have executed 3,000 rebels in Nantes. He said this number as if it were an accomplishment. But here's what the word rebels obscures. The victims of the Nantes drownings were not primarily soldiers. They were not captured combatants from the Vendée uprising. Contemporary journalist Louis-Marie Prudhomme documented the executions in Nantes and attempted to create a breakdown of who died. His numbers, while disputed by modern historians, paint a horrifying picture. 2,000 children, 500 shot, 1,500 drowned, 764 women, 264 shot, 500 drowned, 760 priests, 300 shot, 460 drowned, children drowned by the hundreds. The law of suspects passed on September 17, 1793, had defined suspicious persons in the broadest possible terms. You could be arrested for having the wrong relatives, for expressing insufficient enthusiasm for the revolution, for once having employed servants, for simply being in the wrong place when soldiers came through. Nantes prisons filled with people whose only crime was existing during a revolution. During Carrier's trial, witnesses testified to something called Republican marriages, mariages républicains. According to this testimony, executioners would sometimes strip a man and a woman naked, tie them together, and drown them in the Loire. Some accounts describe these pairings as deliberately ironic. Old with young, children with children, priests with nuns. Now, I need to be honest with you here. Modern historians have debated whether these specific pairings actually occurred as described, or whether they were exaggerated during the trial to increase Carrier's condemnation. The mass drownings definitely happened. We have multiple independent sources confirming them, but the precise theatrical details of Republican marriages remain contested. What we can say with certainty is that the testimony about these practices was presented at Carrier's trial, and the jury believed it. The last major drowning operation occurred on January 29th and 30th, 1794. Carrier decided to completely empty one of Nantes' major detention facilities, the coffee warehouse, known as l'entrepôt de café. Everyone inside would be loaded onto barges and drowned. The records from this final batch show exactly who died. 2 men, one of them 78 years old and blind, 12 women, 12 girls between the ages of 11 and 16, 10 children between the ages of 5 and 10, 5 infants, a blind 78-year-old man, children as young as 5, infants. The Loire had become so contaminated with decomposing bodies that authorities issued a ban on using its water for drinking or cooking. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, Carrier was recalled to Paris. In February 1794, something changed. A member of the Committee of Public Safety, the small group that effectively ran revolutionary France, notified Maximilien Robespierre about what was happening in Nantes. Carrier was summoned back to Paris. The official reason was to participate in ongoing trials. But he was effectively removed from Nantes, and the systematic drowning stopped. For several months, Carrier lived in a kind of limbo. He was back in Paris, still technically a deputy to the convention, but no longer wielding the absolute power he'd held in Nantes. Then came July 28, 1794, the Thermidorian reaction. Robespierre himself was overthrown and executed. The political faction that had orchestrated the most extreme phase of the terror was suddenly out of power, and the new leaders, the Thermidorians, needed to distance themselves from the bloodshed. They needed scapegoats. In September 1794, members of the Revolutionary Committee of Nantes, the local administrators who had worked with Carrier, were arrested and imprisoned in Paris, and these men did something that would seal Carrier's fate. Rather than accepting responsibility for what had happened in Nantes, they blamed everything on Carrier. They insisted that he had ordered the drownings, that he had personally directed the executions, that they had merely followed commands. This testimony reached the Revolutionary Tribunal, and it reached the public. But the real turning point came in October 1794. Before Carrier himself was put on trial, another trial took place that would prove crucial. 132 men from Nantes, accused vaguely of moderate federalism, had been imprisoned and transported to Paris for trial. These men came from various walks of life: merchants, professionals, ordinary citizens. Their crime was essentially being insufficiently radical. Carrier had initiated their prosecution. He expected them to be convicted and executed. On October 17th, 1794, the Revolutionary Tribunal delivered its verdict. All 132 defendants were acquitted. Every single one. During their trial, these acquitted victims provided testimony. They described what they had witnessed in Nantes. They described the drownings, the arbitrary arrests, the children loaded onto barges. This testimony was devastating. It turned public opinion decisively against Carrier. People in Paris who had perhaps heard rumours about Nantes now had names and faces and specific accounts. The convention could no longer protect Carrier even if it wanted to. On September 3rd, 1794, Carrier was arrested. On November 11th, a commission of 21 appointed to investigate Carrier issued its report, concluding that there were grounds for prosecution. On November 19th, the National Convention ordered that Carrier's case be brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. On November 23rd, the convention voted by roll call on whether to commit Carrier to trial. The vote was 498 to 2 in favour. 498 representatives voted to put Carrier on trial. 2 voted for the decree with conditions. The man who had once been a hero of the revolution was now almost unanimously condemned by his fellow revolutionaries. On November 27th, 1794, Carrier was brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The trial took place at the Conciergerie, the medieval palace on the Ile de la Cité that had been converted into a revolutionary prison and courthouse. This was the same building where Marie Antoinette had been imprisoned for 10 weeks before her execution on October 16th, 1793, almost exactly 1 year before Carrier's own trial began. During the Reign of Terror, approximately 2,900 prisoners had passed through the Conciergerie to stand before the Revolutionary Tribunal. Of those, 2,780 were condemned to death. The Conciergerie was known as the antechamber to the guillotine. Now Carrier sat where the Queen had sat, where Danton had sat, where countless enemies of the Republic had awaited judgment. Carrier wasn't tried alone. 30 individuals stood accused together. Carrier, members of the Nantes Revolutionary Committee, and other administrators who had participated in or facilitated the drownings. The charges against Carrier were extensive: murder of civilians, including women and children, drowning of 1,800 to 2,600 victims in mass executions, direction and organisation of mass drownings at Nantes, execution without trial or due process, theft and acts of greed, exacerbating strife and social division, acts characterised as counter-revolutionary in their brutality. That last charge carried particular irony. Carrier, the committed revolutionary, was being accused of counter-revolutionary behaviour because his atrocities had been so extreme that they undermined the revolution itself. The trial lasted approximately 11 weeks. During this time, witness after witness came forward to describe what had happened in Nantes. Jean-Marie Philippe, a miller whose mill sat on the Loire, testified that bodies floated past his mill for weeks. The water, he said, ran red. Members of the Revolutionary Committee of Nantes, the same men who had blamed Carrier, testified against him in detail. They described specific drownings, they named specific victims, they recounted specific orders Carrier had given. Witnesses described the sounds, the screaming as the barges sank, the gunshots as guards picked off anyone who tried to swim. They described the sights, the bodies caught in the nets of fishermen, the corpses washing up on the riverbanks for months afterward. They described the Republican marriages, they described the children. Faced with this overwhelming testimony, Carrier mounted what can only be described as a weak and ineffective defence. He claimed ignorance of many of the specific charges. When pressed, he made sarcastic, dismissive statements rather than offering substantive legal arguments, but his primary defence strategy was significant. He argued that he had acted under orders from Paris. The Committee of Public Safety, Carrier claimed, had authorised his measures. The National Convention had given him broad authority to pacify the region by all necessary means. He was simply following the directives of his superiors. There was just one problem with this defence. No written orders authorising mass drownings were ever produced as evidence. The records from the Committee of Public Safety showed general directives to suppress the revolt. They contained nothing specifically mandating the drowning of civilians, children or priests. Carrier could not point to a single document that said, "drown them." The decisions in Nantes had been his decisions. In his final statement before the tribunal, Carrier made one last argument. "Everyone is guilty here," he declared, up to the bell of the president. It was an attempt to implicate the entire revolutionary system, the judges, the convention, everyone who had enabled the terror. If Carrier was guilty, then so was everyone who had supported the policies that sent him to Nantes in the first place. There was a certain logic to this argument. The terror had not been one man's project. Carrier had not invented revolutionary violence. He had simply applied it with particular enthusiasm. But the tribunal was not interested in philosophical debates about collective responsibility. They were interested in making an example. After approximately 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. But here's what's remarkable about the outcome. Of the 30 accused individuals who stood trial with Carrier, only 3 were sentenced to death. Carrier himself and his 2 principal accomplices, Grandmaison and Pinard. The other 28 defendants were acquitted and released. 28 men who had participated in or facilitated the drownings walked free. This outcome tells us something important about what this trial was really about. The Thermidorians weren't interested in comprehensive justice for the victims of Nantes. They needed a symbol. They needed to demonstrate that the excesses of the terror would be punished, but not too thoroughly, because too many of them had been complicit in one way or another. Carrier would bear the weight. Carrier would be the face of revolutionary excess. Everyone else could move on. After his conviction, Carrier was returned to his cell in the conciergerie to await execution. He would have known exactly where he was. The irony would not have been lost on him. He was imprisoned in the same medieval fortress where Marie Antoinette, the queen he had helped to condemn, had spent her final weeks. We don't have detailed records of Carrier's last days. We don't know if he wrote letters, or received visitors, or expressed remorse. What we know is that he waited, as thousands had waited before him, for the cart that would take him to the guillotine. On the morning of December 16th, 1794, Carrier was prepared for execution. The ritual was standardised by this point. His hands were bound behind his back, his shirt collar was cut away to expose his neck, his hair was cropped short so it wouldn't interfere with the blade. He was loaded onto a cart and transported through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, the great public square where the Revolution had conducted its most significant executions. This was where Louis XVI had died on January 21st, 1793. This was where Marie Antoinette had died on October 16th, 1793. This was where Danton had died on April 5th, 1794. And this was where nearly 30,000 people had gathered to watch Jean-Baptiste Carrier die. 30,000 people. Many had travelled overnight to be there. They filled the square, pressed against buildings, climbed onto rooftops for a better view. They came for different reasons. Some came seeking justice for the victims of Nantes, justice for the priests, the women, the children who had drowned in the Loire. Some came seeking entertainment, because public executions had become a form of popular spectacle during the Revolution. Some came because they had lost family members to Carrier's regime and wanted to see his death with their own eyes. And some came simply because this was history, and they wanted to witness it. Waiting at the guillotine was Charles-Henri Sanson. Sanson held the hereditary title of Monsieur de Paris, Gentleman of Paris, the official executioner. He had held this position since 1778. By December 1794, he had personally overseen nearly 3,000 executions. He had executed the king. He had executed the queen. He had executed Robespierre just 5 months earlier. Sanson was not a sadist. By all accounts, he took pride in performing executions as humanely and efficiently as possible. He had personally designed improvements to the guillotine to make it faster and more reliable. A clean death, in his professional view, was the only acceptable outcome. He had no reason to expect anything unusual with Carrier. Carrier was brought to the scaffold and made to kneel before the lunette, the wooden frame where the condemned person's neck was positioned. The guillotine was designed for speed. The blade was angled to slice rather than chop. The fall was precisely calculated. Under normal circumstances, death occurred in a fraction of a second, faster than the human nervous system could register pain. This was the Enlightenment's gift to capital punishment, a death so fast it was almost merciful. Sanson's assistants positioned Carrier's head, the blade was raised, and then something went wrong. According to the account recorded by Charles-Henri Sanson's son in memoirs written after his father's death, the guillotine performed extraordinarily poorly when executing Carrier. The blade did not fall cleanly. The exact mechanical details are unclear from the historical records. The blade may have jammed partway down the groove. It may have failed to sever completely on the first attempt. What we know is that multiple attempts were necessary to complete the execution. In Sanson's son's words, "Never had I seen the guillotine fail so dramatically." It was as if the machine itself rebelled against granting Carrier an easy death. The 30,000 people watching understood immediately what was happening. Here was a man who had engineered the prolonged drowning deaths of thousands, who had designed a method of execution specifically intended to be slow, to allow his victims to feel the water rising around them, to give them time to understand they were going to die. And now the guillotine, the machine of quick and merciful death, was refusing to grant him that mercy. The crowd saw divine justice. They saw the hand of God intervening to ensure that Carrier would suffer as his victims had suffered. Whether you believe that interpretation or not, the symbolic power of the moment was undeniable. Eventually the execution was completed. Carrier's head was separated from his body. The crowd erupted, not just in cheers, but in something closer to catharsis. Here was the man responsible for the drowned children, the murdered priests, the contaminated river. Here was his head, held up for all to see. Justice, they believed, had finally been delivered. Carrier's execution on December 16, 1794 set a precedent. Less than 5 months later, on May 7, 1795, Fouquier-Tinville was brought to the same scaffold. Fouquier-Tinville had been the chief prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the man who had sent thousands to the guillotine, including Marie Antoinette. He attempted the same defence Carrier had tried. He blamed the Committee of Public Safety and Robespierre for the executions, arguing that he had simply followed orders. It didn't work for him either. Fouquier-Tinville was guillotined along with 15 other officials of the tribunal. But here's what's worth noting about the aftermath. Carrier was executed. Fouquier-Tinville was executed. A handful of other prominent terror figures faced justice. But the vast majority of those who had participated in revolutionary violence, the local committees, the informers, the administrators, the guards, never faced any consequences. Remember those 28 defendants who were acquitted alongside Carrier? They went home. They resumed their lives. Some of them prospered under subsequent governments. The Thermidorian reaction needed symbols of accountability, not comprehensive justice. Carrier served that purpose. His name became synonymous with revolutionary excess, with the terror at its worst. Everyone else could pretend they had just been following orders. Carrier's name has endured in French historical memory as a byword for atrocity. When people speak of the Revolutionary Terror's worst excesses, they speak of Nantes. They speak of the drownings. They speak of Carrier. The Loire River eventually recovered. The bodies were cleared. The water became safe to drink again. But the memory of what happened there, the systematic drowning of priests and women and children, the industrial efficiency of vertical deportation, the bureaucratic euphemisms covering mass murder, that memory persisted. Jean-Baptiste Carrier died believing he was a victim of political convenience, sacrificed by colleagues who were just as guilty as he was, scapegoated for crimes that the entire revolutionary system had enabled. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he also wasn't innocent. The decisions made in Nantes were his decisions. The barges with their built-in plugs, the systematic emptying of prisons, the children loaded aboard, no one in Paris had ordered those specific choices. Carrier had invented vertical deportation himself. The guillotine that malfunctioned on December 16, 1794, had been designed to make death quick and merciful, the Enlightenment's answer to the brutal executions of the old regime. Carrier had rejected that mercy for his victims. In the end, through mechanical failure or divine intervention or simple bad luck, it was rejected for him too.